Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Fanny Glover. I'm the Director of Equity Inclusion here at Early Care and Learning Council, and I'm honored for the program that we will have today and our special guest. But before we get started, what I'd like to do is to acknowledge the indigenous land and culture of New York. We honor the land as the Creator intended, in that we commit to keep it clean and support efforts to make it safe for all. We can show honor to the native keepers of the land by recognizing the value of their culture, by learning the truth of their history and how it shaped this great country. Thank you. With that being said, I'd like to talk a little bit about our program today, which we are so excited about, and that is locating the problem in the environment as opposed to in the person, and why context matters. In this talk, Dr. Bhambhani will focus on how the context and environment, like intergenerational trauma, social structures of power and privilege, impacts Black, Indigenous, and people of color life, particularly for young queer people of color. And he will simultaneously weave in the talk about considerations for coping with racial stress and trauma and creating a context for healing. Now, a little bit about our speaker. I am so excited about hearing his presentation today. Dr. Yash Bhambhani is a psychologist and a lecturer, and originally from India, and received his PhD from the University of Mississippi. He specializes in acceptance and commitment therapy, treatment of substance abuse disorders, and minority health. He also uses a contextual behavioral framework to look at difficulties which locates the problem in a person's environment as opposed to within them, and thus also look at solutions within their environment. So without further ado, I'd like to just share this platform with Dr. Bhambhani. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Fanny. I really appreciate that. And also welcome and thank you to all the attendees for being here and for your time and for your presence. So I'll get started here. By training, I'm a clinical psychologist, and I am currently finishing up a postdoctoral fellowship at Montefiore Medical Center. I've been here for the past 2 years and lived in the Bronx for the past 2 years. And I will be an attending psychologist at Montefiore in a few weeks. And throughout my training, this is a thread that I've noticed and that has been really most useful is, a contextual analysis and looking at what causes behavior and how we can modify behavior.
Excuse me, Dr. Bhambhani, could
you
place us on presentation mode?
Oh, we're not in presenter mode?
No. That's it.
Huh. So can we all?
Well, if you can't, we'll. You had it on presentation mode earlier.
How about now? Can we all see the
Perfect.
slide?
Perfect.
Okay.
Yes, thank you.
Okay, and then let me know if the slide now changes. Huh, strange. Sorry, give me 1 second. Tech issues. Wow. Sorry, y'all. Let me figure out what's happening here. Okay, I know what's happening. I'm going to my last slide. So, can you all see the slide change now? Yeah. All right, thank you. Sorry about the hiccups. So just a brief agenda. I'll introduce a contextual paradigm. discuss how historical and present conditions of inequity impact marginalized people, and discuss ways to heal racial stress and trauma. So talking about this contextual paradigm and a little more about what I mean here, people, exist in an environment and surrounded by other things. We don't exist in a vacuum. And when I say environment or context, I mean everything that surrounds people, whether that be other people, our country's laws, social mores and customs, culture, family, friends, anyone. So we're impacted then by what we're surrounded by. An easy example of this, for example, if you look at kids are extraordinarily sensitive to context when provided with positive reinforcement or encouragement. Kids really start responding to that so quick, even at a young age, and will do more of the things that we encourage them for. Like, if you say, "Good job, little man," in labeling an apple, and kids will smile and do more of that. They're also extraordinarily sensitive to punishment. And if you punish them, they stop doing whatever they were doing and, will respond with discouragement. Similarly, in kids' environment, if they have a lot of toys to play with, lots of reading, lots of adults like modeling how to express emotions or how to manage emotions, these kids learn and grow up to be more emotionally mature and more with more capacity to respond and adapt to their environment. So this applies to all people. And I think in some ways, we almost forget that as kids become adults. For example, I often have this thought, even as I go around the world thinking, why can't they just be more emotionally present? Or why can't this person that I'm talking to be more emotionally mature or react in a better way? Or if I'm working with a student, why can't they read the textbook? Or why can't they finish their assignments? Or sometimes stereotypes come up too, something like, why can't they just work harder? Why can't they do their job? And it becomes almost second nature to locate these problems in the person and to say that, it's their personal fault. But that person could be a group too. And we can say it's the group's fault. And thus, stereotyping. But I think that analysis doesn't work for too long. And because we've tried to so much, and then we try to change people by telling them about it or blaming them about it. Instead, perhaps what we can look at is, just as we look at children and where they are and what they're doing, just expand that and look at what's happening in the context around people.
Oh, excuse me, Yash. I'm sorry to interrupt you.
Mm-hmm.
Have you progressed to any of the following slides, or are you still on the title?
Yeah, I am on the slide with the child. Can you all not see that?
It appears to still be on the title slide.
Oh, I'm so sorry.
No problem. One moment, everyone.
Sorry, you all. I don't know what tech issues I'm having today. Let's see.
If you needed to put it back into the PowerPoint mode that you had before, you can.
Mm-hmm.
And
let's see. Let me try something else, and then perhaps we can see.
I know everyone is like us, is eager to hear. And for us visual learners.
Yeah, no, slides are important. I'm not sure what is going on though?
Just put it back in the original mode and then we can move forward from there.
Yeah, perhaps I'll do that.
Okay.
So you can still see if I change the slide, now what can you see? Sorry.
It's a blank screen now. We do not see your PowerPoint at all.
Oh. All right. We will improvise.
There it is.
There we go.
Yeah.
We will just increase the font and see if it can fit. All right, how about now?
This works.
Okay. So this was the agenda, discussing introducing a contextual paradigm. And then how do I move the slides? Funny. All right, so talking about a contextual paradigm, and then I was talking about, people exist in a context here. For example, people are surrounded by their environment, and their environment impacts them. And their environment can be people who are surrounding them, social laws, legal laws, social mores, culture, including everything that has transpired in the past, because things that have happened in the past also continue to affect us. For example, if you look at a child, how the child's parents were brought up might affect their parenting. The parents' own parenting style, the culture that they exist in, will affect their parenting. So linking that back again, to children, and how our environments continue to impact us even as adults. So when we think about changing people's behaviors or changing any social circumstances, perhaps we can look instead at what's happening in the environment, look for causes in the environment, and then look for solutions in the environment as well. For example, I live in New York City, so homelessness is a big problem. And first visiting here, people might have the thought, when I first visited here, the thought there's a lot of homelessness. Why are people doing that? Blaming people for it. Or perhaps that's not the problem. That's the result of the social conditions. And I want to highlight here how common it is for us to have these judgments about people, or even have biases come up. And perhaps I want to invite you all to notice your own biases and notice your own reactions to the material that I share. And all of those are welcome. My intention here is to not use shame or guilt as a motivator, instead of using something to move towards, or what we care about, our values, as a motivator. Because shame and guilt aren't very long-lasting or long-term motivators. Like if you think about times that you've really wanted to do something or cared about something, and perhaps when you were really motivated, I'm going to ask you to think of a time like that. For me, for example, I was pursuing a PhD, and I wanted to do it because I love psychology. So I was really motivated, and I love talking to people. So, I pursued in this for like 7 years, moved to the US, moved to Mississippi, then moved to New York. And instead, there are some times when we do things based on, running away from something or wanting to make like shame and guilt disappear. And in those times, we're just focused on making that shame and guilt go away, as opposed to moving towards something that's better, or that's more workable, or that's better for all of us. So just an invitation to, again, to notice judgments that come up for you today and welcome them in, and coming back to noticing what we were talking about. And the spirit of that, of course, one of the judgments I'm having, and I'm myself having, is why did this tech thing have to go around today of all days and not happen before? But so on, I come back to what matters, and I care about equity for everyone. So I'll proceed in this fashion with a modified PowerPoint. So I'll talk about briefly, how historical and present conditions, these social circumstances of inequity impact marginalized groups. Perhaps using housing and work as a first example. So a little bit of a story history time. During the 1930s in the US, during the Great Depression, the economy was losing, people were losing money, people couldn't afford their housing payments. So in an effort to revive the economy and help people stay in their homes, there were programs to lend people money. And one of the things that these programs did, and banks, for example, did, was send people out into the world, into the country, and categorize neighborhoods and buildings based on how good of an investment they are. And for example, in New York City, this was done, like all over the 5 boroughs and in the state too. So they noted these things: type construction, average age, price range, but they noticed and they noted and used that for decision making too. Some other things, such as this: obsolescence and poor maintenance, infiltration of Negroes, elevated structures on Lexington Avenue and Fulton Avenue, mixed races. And this was categorized as detrimental influences. This process of labeling buildings as such is called redlining. And redlining was only outlawed in the late 1970s, I believe. And what redlining led to was whole neighborhoods being labeled as bad investments and cordoned off, as these red areas. And these were the areas that did not receive funding or lending or money to homeowners for buying their homes or staying in their homes, and has led to a whole cascade of financial problems. So this is for example, the labeling that was used, with green being best, blue being still desirable, this off-white, yellow definitely declining, and red as hazardous. So I lived in the Bronx for the past 2 years, and these red areas, South Bronx, this blue area here and off-white area, are areas that are more wealthy and have better neighborhoods, safer neighborhoods, because there was an influx of money and influx of people who were able to afford their homes, and neighborhood investment in giving people more jobs, more resources. So those blue areas, are one of the areas is Riverdale, which is as people describe it, the nicer areas of the Bronx. And you'll see this is Manhattan, this is Harlem, again labeled hazardous. And all of this, of course, coincides with, where people of color, Black people or Hispanic, Latinx people have traditionally lived, and has led to lack of investment in these communities. So because of these areas being undervalued and labeled hazardous and not being invested in, this has led to, home values depreciating too. So for example, the same home, which, 4 bedrooms, 3.5 bath, in an area which is more predominantly people of color, or predominantly occupied by more people of color, is valued at $300,000. And a similar home in a white area is valued at $700,000. And in fact, this permeates so much that recently there was a news article I saw where this Black couple put up their house for sale. And when they had viewings with them, there were less offers, and instead they hired someone else to be there, some other people who were white, and presented the home as, not occupied by the Black couple, and the home value went up. This impacts, again, because this happened for so long, we see the impact still today. For example, in intergenerational wealth and generational wealth. So if you were someone who lived, 50 years ago, were able to afford your own home, you had less mortgage payments, less no rent payments, and more money to spend on, say, education or building other assets, as opposed to if you didn't own your home and spend a lot of money on mortgages or rent. Which leads to the accumulation of generational wealth. And if we see that in the US, the net worth of all US households, so the most of the money is held by families that are white, more than about 90%, or a little less than 90% in 2019. So this graph, on the x-axis shows years progressing, and on the y-axis here, it shows percentage of net worth. This green line up here is white people, and the yellow line is Black people, red line Latinx, and blue others. So the share of wealth that people of color hold in the US is less than 10%. And herein, it makes me consider, how do people build wealth then? And how does that happen? And that's something to think about. Another example in terms of wages, this is a busy graph, so I'll just highlight some things. This is median US weekly wages in dollars. And if you notice, the darker blue color is men, the lighter blue color is women. And just to look at, so white people aged between 16 and 24, men earn 605, and Black men earn 457 weekly. This is for the same job. Everything else held constant: training, job, previous experience. Another thing to notice there is that Asian American people earn more, and that's a different history where a lot of people in different categories are lumped together, and it doesn't quite explain everything. But this is another point to notice where intersectionality and differential privilege can come up. And if we continue to look at people aged between 25 and 54, white people, for example, women earn 906, Black women earn 767. This difference holds at every age, and again impacts how much people are earning and how much they're saving, building, and then spending capacity. And then, one of the thoughts of judgments that often comes up for me is that, why don't people just work hard and get a better job, earn more money? And that's, again, a judgment that I've had in the past. I'm totally okay, because, the judgments that we have are almost more automatic. So everything that our thoughts are more automatic. And I don't know if we can blame anyone for those. For example, if I ask you to not think about lunch right now, or not think about what you might eat or what you're eating, or not think about ice cream is going to be the first thing that pops up in our minds. So we can't blame people for having judgments, and instead we can look at actions. So just to share, one of the judgments I had, is, why don't people work harder or get a better job? There was a study done in 2017 where people made fake resumes with different names and sent these fake resumes to various employers. These resumes, which mentioned race and ethnicity, got lower callbacks or lower invitations for interviews. And instead, resumes that were more whitened, meaning that people's names were changed. They didn't sound For example, more ethnic, people got higher callbacks. So here the y-axis is the percentage of resumes that earned requests for interviews, and the x-axis here is like comparison for African-American people and for Asian people. The dark green bar is non-whitened resumes, so with people's say original names. I think one of the names they used for Black people was Jamal, and where they whitened the resume, that's the lighter bar here. They changed the names to sounding more white, say Jake. And those names that sounded more white got almost double the amount of requests for interviews, and everything else was same. The qualifications, experience. So just another example where these conditions that have happened before permeate our life and permeate people of color's lives in particular. Let's look at briefly education. Black preschoolers are about 3.5 times more likely to receive an out-of-school suspension. And that's because, again, in the media and in the past, Black kids have been viewed as less innocent and as having more negative intentions because of bias in the past. And this implicit bias that Black children are troublemakers. This starts at preschool and goes on to middle school, high school too, where there are documented studies that show children of color in high school receive harsher punishment, and even up to juvenile detention, and leading to the school to prison pipeline. And teachers have lowered expectations from these children of color in math and science, leading them to not having encouragement to, for example, pursue a STEM degree, which is science, technology, engineering, and mathematics. And thus holding people back. So, again, here in school, for example, in high school, let's say, when I was doing my PhD, you would see children clients too. And I once saw a 10-year-old boy who was labeled as ADHD, as having ADHD in school, and given lots of detentions. This little young man was Black. And in my interview with him, I found out that, this was happening all from one teacher, and he was being targeted more. And he was experiencing bullying from other children too. And that's why I couldn't focus in class. So there are these biases that show up again. And there are small changes that we can make, some small and some big. For example, for Black boys, just one Black teacher, having exposure to one Black teacher in school makes a big difference. Early results from new studies suggest matching Black students to at least one Black teacher in elementary school increases their high school graduation rates and intent to go to college. And just to briefly look at New York rates then, 80% of New York State's 200,000 public school teachers were white, 8% were Black, 7% were Hispanic, 3% Asian, and 2% declined to provide racial ethnic information. This is relatively unchanged. In New York City, it's the most diverse, with teachers of color making about 40%, but the number of students of color in New York City in public schools are 80%. So about half as less. And outside New York City, so in the rest of New York State, just 6% teachers are Black or Hispanic, compared to 29% students being Black or Hispanic. As I'm progressing, I'm thinking totally sad, and what a topic that brings us down. This is our reality. And I appreciate your engagement and presence as we talk about these hard things. Talking about dating and friendships and how, centuries of racism permeate here. This is an interview with a Black and Asian biracial male who said, maybe I'm wrong, but it depends on what two races you are. If you're Asian and Hispanic and you come out with fair skin, I think you're always going to be perceived as better than brown or darker skinned. This is a great example from India, where I'm from, where I grew up. This left picture is from a textbook for children, where this woman on the left who's fair-skinned, has more European features, is labeled beautiful. And on the right, this woman who's looks more like indigenous people from India, is darker skinned, is labeled ugly. So it really starts young. And this is how the context impacts us. And if we go further back, we can also look at this history of where light-skinned people had more privilege and better jobs in India. People with darker skin were relegated to the fields and had lower paying jobs. And this, history trickles back to now. And then even in, for example, in media, light-skinned people are given more preference, more representation. So for example, there are bleaching creams in India where, in the picture in the center, this woman applies this cream and becomes lighter skinned. And same on the right for men too. And this is common in the US too, where, ideals of beauty and attraction are often lighter skin and European features. It's something that you can experiment with is Google handsome men and handsome women on Google and see where Google images show up. And this leads to, again, to labeling anything that deviates from that as not professional or not beautiful, leading to, for example, children in school being told to wear their hair a certain way or modify their appearance to fit certain standards. This shows up in dating too. This is a busy slide, but I'm gonna walk you on through it. These are percentage reply rates in each of these little square boxes on OkCupid, which is a dating app. So on the left-hand side here are ethnicities for men who sent messages to women on OkCupid. And on the top here are ethnicities of the women who received these messages. And in these squares are the response rates. So for example, in the top left corner, 22, this is an Asian male messaging an Asian female, and the response rate was 22%. If you look at the Asian female column and go down to white male, it increases to 29. If you go to Black female, we see the Black women respond to most men, but in the other races and ethnicities, the men who have the highest response rate is white men here. If you look at the bottom, we're getting almost 30%, 28, 34% responses from women of different ethnicities. If you look at Black men here, low response rates, 17, 21, 19, 21. This pattern holds up for women messaging men too. But not funnily, I guess, ironically, what we look here, we saw the Black women were responding to everyone. And here, if there's a Black female sender, the response rates are lower from almost every ethnicity. There are these rates for dating for gay people and lesbian women too from OkCupid, and they mirror the same pattern where being white or light-skinned is elevated to a better standard or elevated to more attractive. Similarly, in friendships too, I wonder if there's not enough data documenting interracial friendships as such, if like people, prefer having friends who are lighter skinned. But there is data documenting that, especially since last year, that for Black people, since George Floyd being murdered, that this amount of racial stress and trauma has increased because of people placing demands on them to explain racism. And then there's some amount of racial stress and trauma that comes from friendships too. And for example, people might hear, oh, but you don't act like those other Black people, or you don't act like those other Indian people who always smell like curry. Moving forward a little quicker, talking about intergenerational trauma. So people experience trauma, and it changes our biology too, in addition to changing how we interact with other people. For example, in animal models, if you use rats and traumatize one of the mother rats, and if the mother rat mates with a father rat who was not traumatized, the mother is less present, of course, and that impact of trauma is passed on to the offspring too. And offspring show more characteristics of having experienced trauma. And when these offspring have their own offspring, their own little rat babies, those rat babies also show signs of having experienced trauma without actually having experienced trauma themselves, or having a parent who experienced trauma. So one generation above. And we see similarly for women who were exposed to the Holocaust, that their way their DNA codes for proteins is changed. But exposed to parent and offspring, and provides insight into how severe psychophysiological trauma can have intergenerational effects. And it alters our genetic code such that the genes that code for our response to trauma and depression are impacted. These studies are really hard to do, by the way, because one, we have to cause trauma or find people who've experienced trauma and then subject or measure things, which can be really hard. For example, if the trauma happened some years ago or several hundred years ago, we might not have those people who originally experienced the trauma to measure their genetics. So for example, for African American people, when they were enslaved, in the past for 400 years, that's an impact that's lasting. Cultural trauma that's passed down both in terms of environmental relations, and after enslavement, segregation, and these laws that were racist, like redlining, that impact how much people trust, for example, banking systems, or medical experiment, for example, because of medical experimentation on Black people, for example, the syphilis trials, it impacts how much people trust the medical system. And again, here at this point, I encourage people to check in and see how they feel, because I know I feel like pulling away and not thinking about this, because it makes me feel icky, and it is icky. Perhaps engaging with this can serve a purpose in creating a better world, in creating a world that where effects of intergenerational trauma don't carry on. And I think about this, as I use this example of having two worlds. One world is where we turn our attention away and don't talk about these things, and these inequities persist. And one where we do the harder thing, where we bring our attention, feel uncomfortable sometimes, but that it leads to a better life for all of us. and we have the choice to do, or to pick who we want to be. And again, not as like something out of shame or guilt, but as like a conscious choice. In the interest of time to move forward, I lastly want to talk about, discussing ways to heal racial stress and trauma, and healing, trauma related to other oppressions, oppression around gender, sexuality, disability. This can be, so if these forms are contextual, caused by, environmental circumstances that happened before us, we need contextual solutions. One of which is power in action. So we can't necessarily control what we, react with, the judgments that we have, or thoughts that we have, or feelings that we have, but we can control what we do with our hands and feet, our attention. Or, for example, we can hire more teachers of color, or pass laws that outlaw predatory lending. So we can choose our actions, but we can't often choose these automatic judgments that we might have. Power in naming. So, naming things when they occur, like feelings. For example, if you notice that we're naming feelings that might come up with us in this presentation, that might be guilt or shame, or wanting to turn away, or something that we care about, wanting to name that something is important here. In addition to naming, teaching, talking about discrimination, or talking about the histories that we have had. There's a certain hesitation to do that, that we will be maligning our culture or our world. But in fact, I think if we own up to everything, there's a higher acceptance of that, and a belief that we can make things better. And there's this debate around the country around, teaching critical race theory. And all critical race theory is not a curriculum, it's a way of looking at things. It's an orientation that, again, contextually looks at what happened before and its impacts that trickle down. Another contextual solution that we can have is like, publicly funding or funding of public schools, instead of funding schools through property taxes, which again, because of redlining, leads to undervalued homes in areas more occupied by people of color, leading to less property taxes and less funding for schools, instead having a better system for funding. Power and fair lending. There are lots of student loans. So people of color end up having to take out more loans because of having less access to generational wealth. And oftentimes these loans can be predatory, where if people don't make a payment, there's a very high interest rate, or these loans have to get refinanced. And that's problematic. That can be changed, where we can increase fair lending. Power and pay equity. People who do the same amount of labor, for example, women overall get paid less. And if you look at it with intersectionality, Black women and Hispanic women get paid even less for the same amount of labor. So here's a contextual solution that we can make with paying people equally and paying people fairly. Power and representation. So this especially reminds me of that dating and friendship and attraction, because in the media, people aren't used to seeing examples of people of color in those ways. For example, there was no Black superhero until Black Panther. And I remember Black Panther, when it came out, had such a huge impact on the children because they could see someone who looked like them on screen. As opposed to, if you go back and look at all the Avenger movies, everyone's white. And Chadwick Boseman, RIP, had this huge cultural impact. And I think what we see matters, because if we can see ourselves, we can see different futures, or a different way of being, where someone who's dark skinned can also be considered attractive. And then finally, power and solidarity and coming together. For people of color experiencing racial stress and trauma, this is something that they relied on often. And I think this is something that I recommend, or we talk about in therapy a lot, finding places where you can talk about that with other people of the shared experience and other people who are willing to express solidarity and sit in discomfort with them. And this also takes away the burden from people who are experiencing discrimination or oppression to, make the change. For example, I'm cisgender, and I work with transgender patients, and often transgender patients need a letter of support to be able to get the medical care, gender affirming care that they need. And I consider, that it's my job to do that and make circumstances such that they don't have to seek out these letters of support for getting the care that they need. So if we have power and privilege in certain areas, it's up to us to work for other people and work in solidarity. That's all I have. So looking at things contextually, and I'll end here. I'll pause here for comments and questions that people might have.
Oh, wow. That was very, very powerful. And there were so many major points. And I just know that I encounter people pretty regularly that are totally unfamiliar with the redlining concept. Mm-hmm. And what happened and how that have held back groups of people and in acquiring wealth. And you touched on that so beautifully. Suspension and expulsion. We know that there are many, many articles written from preschool to the prison pipeline. And there are many people who are totally unaware of that research. And you just talked about so many things. And the DNA code changing as a result of trauma. These are huge, huge points made and things for us to ponder, regardless of what your work encounters. I mean, the work that you do on a day-to-day basis, these are things that we should think about. And how do we maneuver this pathway that we find ourselves in on right now? There are several questions, and I'm going to pause for a moment and ask the questions that came in from the audience. And again, thank you so much for that presentation and such powerful points that were made. Here's a question. This is a personal one.
I'll stop the share.
That came from someone, and what they wanted to know was they were curious about you as an Indian immigrant visiting Mississippi, then to New York. How does these issues appear in others' assumptions about you? And how you experience these, or how you respond to them, and what have you learned personally?
There's been so much. I actually moved to Pennsylvania first, in the Northeast, to Scranton, Pennsylvania, and then moved to Mississippi for my PhD, and now here. I would say moving to the South was more of a culture shock, because I think in Scranton, I noticed how, or I didn't notice because I had just moved here, how segregated things were and how the racism was more implicit. In the South, it's a little more explicit, where especially on like school campuses, you'll hear a lot of like racism and talks about that too, and how people of color experience racism on campus, racist incidents. And I think there was a little bit of, for me especially, as having moved here, there was like a little bit of like peeling off the layers from my glasses that happened when I moved to Mississippi. And I suspect that it was because I started experiencing more racism myself. And it took that long for me to like see it. So I think that's how that affected me. And then, of course, investigating, my own biases against people broadly, against Indian people too, and the internalized oppression that I was carrying, and investigating that was really helpful.
Thank you.
Uncomfortable, but very helpful.
Yeah.
And I think what this has helped me to do and look at things contextually is like have more compassion for myself and for other people.
Yeah.
And enable like better connections.
Yes, absolutely. Here's another question. We have several. Here's another question. Is there any research that surveys what an individual considers as a beautiful person? Yeah, and some ranking of looking at photos and that sort of thing that you're aware of.
So there's some research that actually I recently reviewed that asked Asian people and white people to rank photos, and across both categories, the white people who in the photos who were white were rated as more attractive. And there is some studies that I've done that I've talked about how gay and bisexual men of color talk about experiencing this like sense of being labeled unattractive, even by members of their own peers, and preferences that people have for light skin and European features. And that phenomenon is called sexual racism. And there are a lot of studies documenting how people experience sexual racism and finding certain characteristics more attractive.
Absolutely. I've shared this with many, even some on this Zoom. My 6-year-old grandson, who was 5 last year, his mother is Native, Indigenous, and Italian. His father's African American, and he said to me last summer, he said, "I am so glad I am white like my mommy." And I said to him, I said, "Sweetheart, you're not white." And then we had a conversation, mom, dad, all of us, we had conversations, and we purchased books and talked about melanin and all of that.
Yeah.
But I asked him gently, like, why did he think it was better to be white like mommy? 5 years old at the time, he said to me, "Because we're treated better." 5 years old. I that almost took my breath away. I have to be honest. And it starts so early. It starts so early in thinking this white, darker, lighter thing, but he noticed. He's 5 years old. So I just thought I'd share that. Yeah, there are other questions, but here's one, and I hope it's in several pieces, so I'm hoping I'm going to pull it together. And that is, this is someone, in light of challenges that some agencies are having in identifying or recruiting BIPOC population, the question is, do you think that the study that was done on the resumes was more like to for-profit organizations versus agencies or nonprofits? If I understood that question correctly. And I sort of vaguely remember the study, but I don't remember who
the study
that was.
Yeah, I think the study responded to a number of advertisements. So it was like real job advertisements. And I think it was a broad range of advertisements. I can look up the exact one. And I'm sure it was a broad range. And I think the difficulty that companies have in recruiting BIPOC populations, again, I look at like contextually, why might that be? Because one, college is expensive. And then two, if, for example, companies hire one person who's like, person of color or Black or Indigenous, there's a lot of emotional labor and educational labor that falls on them. So one contextual solution that some universities have figured out around that is like, batch hiring. So like hiring a number of people of color so that, they have support too and don't have to do like all that labor, which is really helpful because again, like lots of universities that go to, are predominantly mostly white professors. So I think, we can look at again contextually why that's harder to recruit and then address those solutions. And again, some of these are like more, of course, harder. Some of these are more short term, but I think we can chip along and chip away at these inequities.
Yeah. Thank you so much. I think that pretty much bring us to the end of our Q&A session. And I can't thank you enough for this very powerful presentation and for hanging back and answering all of these questions. We are seeing in the chat box that there are requests. How can they have access to this recording so they can listen to it again, share it with others? And that's exactly what we're going to do. Right, Elijah?
Absolutely.
Yeah. So again, thank you so very much. This was phenomenal. All the data that you brought forward was just wonderful. And we want to thank each and every one of you who took time from your very busy schedule to spend this hour with us, because we know you could have spent it any place else, but you chose to spend it with us. And for that, we are thankful and we are very grateful. And we're wishing you the very best the rest of the day. And we'll see you next month. Again, thank you so much. Yash.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me. And it's a pleasure. And thank you for sticking around through my tech glitches and difficulties, everyone.
No problem at all.
No problem at all. None whatsoever. Thank you. Everybody have a great day.